Yeah, so I'm curious to learn, what your background sort of is and how you came to join the Intuit design system team.
Sure. So I've been with Intuit for a little over a year and 3 months now. Before that, I was partner at an enterprise UX agency.
Yep.
We did mostly enterprise software design. And I got, I interviewed, I actually knew Suzanne Pelican, who at the time, because she had spoke at some meetups that I run for, called Enterprise UX meetups. And I was always really impressed with her. And I had always thought of Intuit as a design sort of driven company.
Yeah.
So, coming out of an agency world, I felt like I was constantly selling even really large clients like an Intuit on how to build and design and even ship your product, but really not having experienced that from a large software company perspective. So that was really what I was looking for in my career. And then the small business group, basically QuickBooks side of Intuit, had a design system working for a while known as Harmony. And so I took over when I started for the previous person that was managing Harmony. And it was just an interesting, I just found it an interesting challenge. I've always loved, coming from enterprise, I've always loved systems, learning about different systems and what makes them tick, especially, not necessarily even from a technology standpoint all the time, but I love people and processes and what tools do you use. And so I kind of had the benefit of walking into a design system that had already done a significant amount of sort of change across the company, and it had been very successful, at least for Intuit, in terms of changing the landscape of especially QuickBooks and all the products under that, to the point where, all the top level executives saw it as sort of a key contributor to the success, at least of that business group. So I had the benefit of coming in with that sort of groundwork already laid for me. And really what I was looking to do was take the design system to the next level, figure out how to add some pieces to it maybe that were missing. Design systems can become dated or they can become irrelevant to companies for a variety of reasons. And so part of what I found interesting and challenging was how to make it, more relevant and how to make it solve problems that the company was having, now when I joined, which were different from when the problems it was trying to solve when they started Harmony. So all those kind of combined, I just, I loved a new challenge, and I think the stars aligned for me somewhat in that, I was walking into a design system that already had some legs underneath it. But there's a good and the bad to that too. There are some legacy issues with the design system that I also inherited too.
Yeah. You mentioned that the problems that the design system originally aimed to solve versus the problems you were trying to solve were sort of different. So how had those problems changed over time from when it was first created to when you joined the team?
Sure. So I think that one of the problems with, I won't call it a problem, we'll call it an opportunity, maybe to put my sort of leadership hat on, was that Harmony in and of itself really was focused on taking QuickBooks Online products and making them have a cohesive experience. And I think what changed over the business is people started to realize that, look, your customer experience is actually end to end. It's not just your product. It's everything from the point in which they hit your marketing website to even when they call up and talk to a care agent, that's all really part of your customer experience. And when we looked across that landscape, it was very disparate and very all over the place. And so the company's mindset had shifted to thinking about really the product only being the core tenet of the experience to looking more holistically at what we call the end-to-end experience. So that was one change. Another change was that mobile became more of a focus. So, Harmony started in the early on days of, especially for mobile apps within Intuit, being sort of not really evolved, not well adopted. And so, the early stages of Harmony it was really for a web desktop sort of product experience. And the company had shifted in terms of wanting to focus on mobile, or even mobile first. And we didn't have a design system at the time that really supported that. Some of the other sort of things that I think had changed for Intuit is we had decided as an Intuit wide ecosystem. So now think QuickBooks, think TurboTax, think Mint, and a product group we have called ProConnect. And because Harmony had been fairly successful as a design system sort of enacting change for one business unit, it makes sense that all the business units began to see like, well, we actually could benefit from a design system because we're now seeing customers move from product to product, and those are very different experiences. So the first part of Intuit design system was aligning on sort of the core tenets of what we consider for our system, which are really the brand visual language. Mm-hmm. And so that was really, when I came into the business, when I came into Intuit, it was really starting with, all right, well, let's at least align on our core tenets of our visual language, and then we can begin to build on that. And so for what those were for us were logos, also product naming, typography, color palette, and that's what we kind of start.
Joe, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, got it. Your video just cut out for a second. But yeah, as you were saying, you were talking about how first you had to sort of define a consistent like brand visual language between the different products, right? Oh, there we go. Joe, can you hear me? All right, let's see here. So Joe, are you there? Oh, Joe, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's all good. Cut out there for a second.
So what we were talking about, the sort of visual language between the brands?
The language, between brand and how the challenge sort of became turning this successful design system into something that could connect like multiple products together, right? It was no longer about the components and the patterns and the efficiency of like the QuickBooks product, but about all these other different products and now having to kind of tackle this much larger scale project in the design system.
Right. And to be honest, we're still in the midst of it. For a company of Intuit's size, I think we're at 8,000 employees. It's going to be a long journey. But I think what we're beginning to see the fruits of is proving the model of our process in terms of working together as brands. Because we have really different customers and use cases in it. So I think that's the biggest challenge for at least Intuit design system.
Got it. So when you were working on unifying all these products, the first step was sort of as you mentioned, the sort of coming up with a consistent branding and visual language across the different products. After that part, what was sort of the next challenge that you guys were trying to tackle in the project?
Well, I actually think that the first challenge of it was, aside from arriving at a common visual language, the other challenge was in arriving at a process and a contribution model, and sort of a decision-making framework that we could scale, especially where all the business units into it felt like they had ownership, felt like they had a sense of the design system is, by the people, for the people. So as I was talking to Nathan Curtis yesterday, and we were talking about the same kind of concept. So that was crucial to get right, because before I got to the company, there had been sort of central top-down driven initiatives to try to get all the brands to sort of adhere or be cohesive. And those initiatives, from my understanding, had failed just from the standpoint that they were top-down driven. So one of the first things we wanted to get right was making sure we're taking a more of a bottom-up approach in terms of not only what gets proposed to be added to the system, but then also how decisions get made and then how decisions get disseminated. So that really, I think, is the crucial piece to making it work. And what that's really, to use another Nathan Curtis example, that's really having a small sort of central team to help drive initiatives, but then really having a delegated model where there's a whole wide variety of stakeholders that give you kind of that diversity of thought that you need. So to be honest, I think that was actually the more crucial piece to the design system.
Got it. So how did you guys structure out your design systems team? When you joined, for instance, was there already a pretty robust team in place, or did you guys then have to hire more people for the design system team and figure out, what that hierarchy and just, interaction with other business units looked like?
Yeah, so the QuickBooks side of the house had already had essentially a design systems team, which I came into. And so that consisted of 4 designers. And when I came in, one of the things I restructured is we built, first I brought in 2 contract front-end developers to work with the design system team. And then we actually built out a design engineering team that works in parallel with design systems. So that way we could really have a nice blend of designers and developers. But again, we were still operating mainly under QuickBooks with that model. And then when we became more involved with Intuit design system, what we decided is there needs to be a central team to drive this. So at the Intuit sort of central org group, we hired a small team, and that was a designer, a developer, and a program manager, essentially which that person acts basically like a product manager. And then each of the business units have sort of assigned representatives that really drive the initiatives forward. So I'm I'm the representative for QuickBooks. There's another equivalent for TurboTax, Mint, and ProConnect. And we meet multiple times a week, going over, reviewing proposals, talking about what we're going to do next, aligning our roadmaps together. And then we try to involve different designers and teams from each of our businesses to actually be the boots on the ground, so to speak. Sorry about that. The boots on the ground, so to speak, doing the work. Yeah. And the central team really acts as making sure the work scales for the ecosystem, making sure the documentation's tight, and then making sure that the information is sort of collected centrally and disseminated out to all the teams.
Got it.
And we're, like I said, we're still kind of in the early stages of that. We're building basically a toolkit or a source of truth for Intuit design systems, starting with components and those sort of foundational visual language elements. Whereas, on QuickBooks Harmony side, we've actually had a site, a source of truth for a long time. So we're kind of taking all of our learnings from Harmony, and we actually have a new site, design.quickbooks.com. We're taking all those learnings and kind of applying them now at an Intuit-wide level.
Got it. So how many people total are on the design systems team now at Intuit?
If you were to talk about full-time employees that are dedicated 100% of their capacity to design systems, across Intuit, we probably have 8 or 9 people. If I were to add in sort of all the contributors, though, then we're probably getting up into like 30 or 40 people. But a lot of those people are just brought in sort of part-time capacity to drive through whatever initiative that we're working on at the time. In terms of dedicated team members, yes, it's like 8 or 9 full-time employees.
Got it. And is your work 100% dedicated to the design system?
I am, but I'm kind of straddled between the two. So QuickBooks in and of itself has a whole bunch of products under it, and QuickBooks, just to give you an idea of scale, the small business group or the QuickBooks group has 170 designers in it, just in QuickBooks. Right. Whereas all of Intuit has, I think, 200 something. So, over 2/3 of at least the design support we have to offer is just for QuickBooks.
Right.
Because there's QuickBooks Self-Employed, QuickBooks Accounting, there's Desktop. It just goes on and on and on. So I'd say I probably spend about 60% of my time on components and patterns changes just within the QuickBooks ecosystem. And then as we're doing that, we're trying to either think about how to scale them for Intuit wide, or use stuff that we know some of the other brands have more established, like TurboTax has a lot of really great UI components and patterns that we're starting to leverage now. And so the other 30% of my time I'm trying to dedicate to the Intuit design system.
Got it.
And it might get more over time.
So what does the sort of approval process look like for the design system there? Curious to understand how the design system kind of evolves over time based on suggestions from contributors. Is it this small centralized team of, you mentioned, like 8 or 9 people who make the decision of when we're making an update to a design system because of X, Y, and Z, or are there other people that are involved in that decision-making structure for the design system?
So I'd say that initially a proposal is brought from so first of all, we align all of our roadmaps and we make sure that the design system hopefully is going to provide solutions that we need by X amount of time, right?
Right.
And that's kind of a balancing act. Secondly, once Intuit Design System takes on an initiative, what we do is we'll basically have that person write a proposal. Why, what's the business or the customer case? and then we'll actually turn that into kind of just this document. Think of it like a creative brief.
Yep.
The creative brief is then reviewed by essentially kind of like the driver's board, which I'm on.
Yep.
So, Mint, TurboTax, QuickBooks, ProConnect, we all review everything and go, yep, that's a great addition to our system. Let's move forward with it. And then that team that initially proposed it, from whatever product unit it's from, drives it through. There's a driver, and then they'll go and basically gather use cases from the ecosystem of what this affects. And they'll basically, we call it go broad to go narrow. You'll start kind of doing concept exploration and testing with customers. And then over time, you'll sort of narrow down your focus and iterate down a particular path. This is where we also might start prototyping it in code, putting it possibly in front of customers again in code. And then the final sort of process is the same group basically approves it. We do have approvers above us, which are Leslie Witt, from SBD, and Kurt Walecki from TurboTax. And they're kind of the final approvers. And then it's live. Essentially, if we don't have component code yet, then we would start doing production. But a lot of these things we'll finish with, a coded component. But it could be other things. It could be adding styling variables to our CSS framework. It could be we added a new color to our color palette because we kind of realized that we're having some accessibility issues with one of our colors in particular. So it can be a whole range of things. And the delivery, or sort of the artifacts of delivery, also can range quite a bit.
Gotcha. So is like any designer or developer or even product manager free to suggest changes to the design system, and then it just kind of goes through the review cycle?
Absolutely. Yep.
Gotcha. And how do you guys measure the success of the design system? Are there like certain metrics that you're looking at, whether that's like delivery time or number of inconsistencies across interfaces that you guys kind of look at and try to see if they improve?
That's a great question. I think what we're doing, I think it depends on the element that we're using, but let's say like a UI component gets introduced. What we're starting to measure now is the number of contributions to that UI component. We're measuring the velocity, which would be, let's say, story completion time that it took us to build that component. But now we're taking it to the next level, and we're actually looking at how many instances of that component are being used in the product and where. And we're also starting to look at how much customer traffic is actually going through that component. And over time, what we're thinking is that will allow us to really focus on areas that we really want to refine or get better based upon things that are actually being used a lot. If it's something like, more brand or visual language related, that stuff's tougher to measure, honestly. Like if it's a typeface change, we're measuring things like accessibility and usability for customer feedback. But then there's other more kind of qualitative or even subjective measurements, which is just how are we perceived as a brand? Are we perceived sort of cohesively as a brand? That's another measure we're looking at. We're called brand health. So I think it depends on sort of what the artifact of the system is and how we would sort of measure success. But we're definitely, velocity is huge to us. And then also making sure that what we put out is being contributed to a lot. And then it's being adopted by teams a lot. And then, the next level is that it's actually being used by customers and they like it. So those are the KPIs or the success metrics that we're working with right now.
Got it. And since you've started working at Intuit on the design system, have you guys seen changes or improvements to the product development process as a result of having these design systems in place now across all the different products at Intuit?
So the design system isn't fully adopted across all the products to the same level. I think that QuickBooks probably is has adopted the most things out of the design system out of the other brands. But one of the things we use the design system for is when we changed our visual language, we actually used some new elements of our design system, such as the CSS framework, to roll out all the color changes, all the typography changes across, it was like 12 different products. And so when I got in, when I came into the company, part of what drove this was a lot of the design leaders getting frustrated by saying, we want to change our button colors to green across the board. And all the engineers are telling us this is going to take 40 months or
Yeah.
the estimates were like in the years time frame, right? Where by the time you get done with it, we won't even be using UI anymore. We'll be on to voice or gesture or something. But so when I came in, that was kind of used as this catalyst of changing our button style, right?
Yeah.
And so I think what we looked at is we said, hey, look, we're not all on the same technology stack. So, what can we develop that will sort of help accelerate adoption and help with sort of cohesiveness, or dare I say consistency, which was a CSS framework. And that was just really a lightweight set of semantic variables that you find in any UI component library that we could apply to a variety of components or even marketing websites. So that was kind of our first step is, let's develop a set of style variables. And then we're going to actually go around to all the teams and sort of train them and let them know the variables exist, how to use them. And then we also had to embed and pair programmers and designers with each product team. And it's amazing what happens if you just ask an engineer for an estimate based on a red line spec, you get a very high estimate. Whereas when you sit down with them and you open up the IDE and you start changing the code, right, boy, it goes a lot faster than anyone expected. Right. So I think that was the other part of it, was just really, not just sort of mandating that teams have to adopt it by X time frame, but sitting down with each team and understanding their needs and understanding, because you walk into a product manager's office and you tell them, hey, I want to change all your button colors to green, and I need 2 of your engineers to do that over the next 2 months. And, they slam the door right in your face.
Right.
Whereas when you come in and you go, hey, look, we're changing the whole ecosystem. Here's the reason why. We've done a lot of customer testing and we're getting really good results with this new visual language. How about we sit down with one of your front-end developers and give us a couple days and we'll just crank this out. And that makes the conversation go a lot easier. So we kind of used at least the starting phases of Intuit Design System as a way to prove we can roll out a whole new brand in a fraction of the time that it would have taken us before. And that was a big sort of proof point, I think. So we started really doing the brand work, I'd say about July of last year.
Yeah.
And we rolled it out across at least all of our online products, a couple of our mobile products, and then our web marketing products. It was all done by December.
Wow.
So which, it sounds like a lot of time, but when you're dealing with sort of, again, a scale of all of QuickBooks ecosystem, it wasn't actually a lot of time.
So I'm sure, and you touched on this too, when you're working with a lot of different teams, I'm sure there was a lot of different, maybe even at times conflicting requirements for what the design system should bring to Intuit, right? Since you have so many products involved. How did you guys kind of balance all those requirements and come up with a sort of vision for this design system that would still kind of satisfy all of the stakeholders without it just turning into Frankenstein's like monster?
You mean, how do you like, it sounds like there's two parts to your question. One is sort of how to satisfy all the disparate requirements. And then the other was how to kind of make it future-proof.
Right, exactly.
So it doesn't get stale.
Right.
Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think one is just having sort of a defined process. So like I said, it's really important actually to have a creative brief or some set of requirements initially about what are you trying to accomplish, what's everyone's role, and hopefully that's backed by some customer or some business benefit. So I think, as funny as it sounds, I think it is crucial to at least up front spend a little bit of time defining that stuff. And then I think it's useful for you to gather use cases, at least of flagship products or flagship experiences, because those might be, your highest sort of customer touch points. And you also have to weigh that in a large organization that has lots of products, there might be some products that are on older legacy tech stacks, or just the cost to them to adopt a new design system or whatever it is just too high. So, there's a pretty easy matrix you can make in terms of sort of, cost benefit ratios about adopting a design system. And you can kind of make trade-offs about, what are the elements of the system that you need to be where. And so we did a lot of that. In terms of, we also identified kind of like who are influencers amongst each of the product groups and made sure that they had a hand in helping not only gather use cases, but helping review the design proposals that were coming through so that they felt like their voice was heard. And then once they got back to their product teams, the other advantage of that was, those people had just been involved in the design system work. So who better to be an influencer of that product than that person? So we found a lot of those people and took them out to coffee and beers a lot. And in terms of future-proofing a design system, that's a great question, and it's probably my biggest concern always. And that can be really frustrating to people because most design systems are not on the bleeding edge of innovation. Brad Frost actually had a great article about this recently called like the best design systems are like the really boring ones. Right. And there's some truth to that. If you do believe that, your job as a design system is really to enable the products to do the best work that they can and to support them, but not to be the sort of determinant factor of what gets released in products. The product teams and the marketing teams, they own basically their destiny. And all we can really try to do is, help them achieve that destiny, make sure our tools are the latest and greatest tools, make sure whatever artifacts we're providing to them are really easy to consume, really easy to use, well documented. And I think that in relationships and sort of an inclusive process where people feel part of the design system is the key to future-proofing it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a really interesting point, which was, that future-proofing is sort of this one of the challenges that you guys will kind of always be facing with a design system. Do you find that there's also a challenge around prescribing enough guidelines to ensure consistency and coherence versus giving a little bit of flexibility and wiggle room so that, like you said, that the teams can still be creative and figure out, okay, how do we create something new with this toolkit?
Yeah, that's a great question. at some point you don't want to step on the product designer's toes,
right,
and be so prescriptive that you're really, restricting them from doing their job, which is figuring out how to make, a great experience. And so there's definitely a balance there in terms of, I think, we've made the mistake plenty of times of probably being over prescriptive. We've tried to develop this concept in Intuit design system of having what we call fixed and flexible elements as a way to help kind of give guidance about depending upon your use case or however, whatever context you're going to use it in. We're anticipating all these elements will change. So we're trying to do that. And then the other part of that, I think, would be that this is kind of the difference between a component and a pattern, most people would say. So like you could think of components as being really reusable, really modular. They're usually coded, but they don't necessarily solve that specific of problems. And they're not really that contextually relevant. Whereas, that's why people develop interaction patterns. So you can kind of have a more prescriptive set of instructions of like, for this particular context, this is how we want you to treat, let's say, navigation, or this is how we handle search, or whatever it is. I think that's where you can find that kind of balance of having these really reusable modular things like Lego pieces that can be put together in a variety of ways. But then again, you need some semblance of cohesion. So you have to have some prescriptive instructions, maybe in the form of patterns, maybe in the form of fixed flexible sort of properties on things. I don't know if that answers your question or not,
no,
but
it does. I think what's really interesting is what you talked about, distinguishing between fixed elements and flexible elements, so that right off the bat, you can set expectations around, these elements have to look like this because of whatever. In these, there's a little bit of more wiggle room depending on the particular use case or the product that you're working on. And that's actually really interesting way to kind of resolve that tension between consistency and then still allowing for, creativity.
yeah, and this is like do's and don'ts too for Google Material. Do's and don'ts are another great way to sort of show more example-based guidelines in terms of where you can be prescriptive. Fixed and flexible. That's a concept that I think when we were talking about that, I really struggled with that concept because I felt like it was being overly prescriptive. But then I've seen tons of cases where, designers and developers sort of love those constraints or love to have guidelines around constraints because it gives them, people sometimes do their best work when they're just given a few sets of constraints to work within. So I've kind of come around to realizing that I think those properties on some of our elements actually help people. So that's pretty interesting.
Gotcha. And you had also mentioned that one of the challenges you had faced was there was some legacy technology in the design system as well, right?
Yeah.
How did you guys evolve your technology stack with the design system?
Yeah, so when I came in, there was if we just take, let's say, our web products, there was a variety of JavaScript-based UI component libraries out there. All the usual suspects, yeah. jQuery, little Bootstrap over here, what's the Dojo all over the place. So another initiative I was part of was essentially looking at replatforming the web technology into something more modern. We had another team on Angular as an example. And that was also where we looked at, we kind of borrowed from the Salesforce Lightning sort of design tokens idea of, well, we could at least develop like a CSS framework or a set of Sass variables We can even transpose or transform those variables into like whatever syntax or format we want. So that helped kind of become this bridge between the design system and a disparate set of technology. Separately, we did arrive at using React for our UI components. So we built our UI components using React, ES6 syntax. They're responsive. They do use Flexbox. And then separately, we're kind of looking to do similar with native mobile components. And so we've got sort of some competing technologies at play. One is basically a single page application shell that we can embed in a native app that allows us to show a web experience sort of seamlessly, meaning like we pre-cache everything, all the components are responsive, even adaptive, and the user doesn't really know that it's actually, web.
Right.
Which is kind of funny. Like in my old job, that had been tried so many different ways by so many different companies, and when I heard that, I'm like, this is a terrible idea. But then we actually pulled it off, and it's actually pretty seamless. The other competing technology is like React Native, which when we started down this path of picking React Native was still very much in its infancy, pretty buggy at the time, and so we kind of weren't ready to dive 100% into React. But recently it's made some leaps and bounds. So we're kind of revisiting that. But just to give you like, when we chose to go to React, we from just pure sort of web JavaScript components, we're looking at, on average, it's like 60 to 70% less code.
Oh, wow.
For the React components. So it's significant. And then the other things we're doing are adding like continuous integration. So some CI/CD stuff where, we've got linters, we've got automated functional tests, both locally, kind of like an automated unit test. And then we fire off a more significant set of functional tests, functional automated tests, the minute you try to submit a pull request. So we're trying to tighten up our CI/CD of our library right now. We've made really good progress. Some of the other tools we really liked, the Lightning team had built just for sort of internal testing or internal monitoring of how people are using stuff. We've been looking to build kind of not exactly like they're doing, but had some similar concepts. So yeah, that's basically the kind of where we're at.
Yeah, and so since the design system you guys are working on it, I think in most cases is sort of a blend between design and development. Do you think that for a designer to join a design systems team, that they should have some development background in order to be efficient and just able to communicate with the more technical side of the team?
Not so much. I mean, of course, that's a really nice bonus. I think basic HTML and CSS, yeah, that's probably a must. In terms of, you have to be a hardcore JavaScript programmer? Certainly not. I think what's more interesting for a skill set for me as a designer is systems thinkers. So people that can think scale, can think about, I've heard it described as, you're not designing cars, you're designing the tools that build the cars.
Right.
Or another example is, Nathan Curtis was talking about how, the skill sets involved with a design system team member are a lot more soft skills. So they're like communication. Can you influence people? Can you walk into a room full of a bunch of other designers, executives, and engineers and have everyone essentially convinced by the end of that meeting that we're all aligned on whatever direction we want to go?
Right.
And I think that's really the key skill sets of design system folks, because you're kind of the connective tissues with all these different people. And so it's those social and those soft skills that come in the most handy, more than I think technical skills. And that's hard, when people come on my team, it's like, I know they just want to put the headphones on and start cranking away at Sketch, but it's like unfortunately you're in a lot of meetings because you're having to influence people, the other part of it is you have to see the breadth of what teams are designing in order to have those conversations, in order to figure out like, oh wow, that's a new emerging pattern that we're seeing happening right now. That is a really nice addition. You have to be there and talk to those people to be able to experience that. So I think that's what's hard about, especially in an existing design system. I could see on a small company that doesn't have a design system where it's just like, all right, wipe the slate clean.
Yeah.
Let's do something from scratch. We're not going to talk to you guys until we have V1 out, and then we'll figure out how to have other people start contributing. But when you get to the point of you're at V2, V3, V4, and you really want to involve other people in terms of them feeling like the design system is theirs, that's where those skill sets change of being sort of more soft skills for a designer.
Right. And so now that you guys are further along in the design system, right, more in that sort of V3, V4, or even beyond stages, what are some of the goals that you guys have in mind for the Intuit design system at this current stage in in its evolution?
So I think some of the goals are more around some of the more kind of connective tissue elements of our products and our marketing experiences. Not just a UI component, but you look at things like, headers, notification centers, sign in, sign on. There's a whole slew of stuff that when you look at larger companies, those are really the pieces of connective tissue if you have customers moving from product to product. Like think of Google, right? So I think those are kind of what we're seeing now on the horizon as a big value add that the system can bring to the company. And then the other thing is, so there are some business units that don't have a design system, don't have a team, don't have resources, and for them, it's nice to get a whole bunch of stuff that's highly evolved and been tested essentially for free. Right. Maybe at the hands of QuickBooks and TurboTax, but that's okay because we know that if one of us gets better, we all get better. So I think that's the other thing we're looking forward towards is everyone kind of contributing their own little special areas that they've spent a lot of time focusing on. Like TurboTax, I mean, those guys have been through the ringer as far as like usability testing with customers on all sorts of stuff. The way they build their UIs is really progressive. And so they can bring a set of expertise to the table that we can all benefit from. And vice versa, QuickBooks too has been doing some really interesting stuff in terms of, the new sort of tech stack we're moving with is something that the whole company actually really likes, that new tech stack. So, and just the fact that we've had kind of a functioning design system for longer in the QuickBooks side of the house, we've learned a lot of things about process, and we're able to bring that to bear when we try to do it at a larger scale. So, and then we're looking at other stuff. Like we know the world is moving beyond the graphical UI. We all know that, right? Right. So I think the next challenge I see on the horizon for design systems is that I think a lot of elements of design systems will become automated, or the tools that we all use will export out. You're already seeing this, like Craft from Envision or Inspector or Frontify, or there's all these sort of mini style guide generating apps, and that's only going to get further. And so the next level for us is looking at other forms of user interface that are happening. And, how do you make a system out of those? We don't really know yet. We're kind of just dipping our toes in the water of this stuff. But because we all see that as part of our brand experience, if you're talking to your phone and, we're powering it, or you're chatting, or, VR, AR stuff, it's like those are all ways that our customers are going to experience our brand. And so we're going to want to have a system behind them to make sure they're a cohesive experience, and that they feel like Intuit.
Right. And you bring up a really interesting point too, which yeah, I think hasn't been discussed enough maybe in design systems, is how that will adapt for these new types of product interactions.
Exactly.
Because yeah, when you think about it, design systems so far has mostly been about sort of very almost kind of two-dimensional interactions between people and products. And now when you introduce like sound or AR, VR, right? How do you then might even need to completely restructure your design system, because your kind of product interactions have just completely changed with that as well. So that's actually a really interesting thing to kind of look for on the horizon, like down the years.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what happens there. I'm involved in a couple sort of future trends projects at Intuit, and I'm always looking at stuff from a systems perspective, and I'm always like, what's going to be the system behind that, so I'm that keeps me excited to go into work every day, is knowing that it's not even on the horizon, like that stuff's already here.
Right.
So
if you were to sit down with somebody who's about to embark on creating their first design system, based on all of your experience, right? And this will be sort of a closing question here. What immediate advice would you give them if you could only sort of have a couple minutes to talk to them?
Well, the first question would be questioning why a design system, and I think the answer to that would be, what problems does your organization or your product have that you feel like a design system could provide a solution for, right? And especially, can you explain that to executives and stakeholders, and even quantify that problem? Sometimes you need to, down to a dollar amount or a time amount, or some sort of customer experience metric or whatever. And then based upon that, I would decide what is the design system that we need that fits our org, that fits the problem we're trying to solve for our org. And I think you can go really big, like, I would actually say we probably maybe have too big of a design system sometimes. Or you can go really small. You can just do kind of like the mini bootstrap, and the mini bootstrap library, is plenty fine for, most startups, most small companies. It's themable or whatnot. So my advice would primarily to be, understand what's the problem. We have a saying around our company a lot, which is, don't fall in love with the solution, fall in love with the problem. Because, solutions are always going to change, but I think an understanding of what is the problem that a design system solves for your company would be what I would spend a lot of time on, and making sure you're really clear on that, and making sure you can communicate that to other people.
Right. Going back to sort of making sure that you also are aware of sort of the soft skills that are going to be involved throughout the journey, right? From creating through evolving, because it, even from our experience as a startup, creating our own design system, it is definitely a journey from start to I don't even know if there is a finish point, really. You just continue evolving it, right, over time.
There's really not, but I think it is valuable probably at some point to treat your design system like a product.
Right.
And like a product, you need to have a roadmap, and you need to almost have a product manager to it. And you can have by what sprint do you want to have X? And that could be kind of like a nice milestone. Everyone's happy. You can take that around and say, look what we did in this time. But then soon thereafter, you have to set the expectations like, but hey, now this thing doesn't stop. There's another milestone and another milestone. And even all that stuff we just did, this is a living design system. So if we learn new information that improves upon that, we're going to change it. So I think some executives can think of like a design system as like, okay, cool. So you work on this for a couple months and then we're done and it's all good. Awesome. And so I think it is important to set that expectation of like, no, we have a milestone we're going to hit and you're going to see some success from that. But then this thing keeps going, and setting that expectation early is crucial.
Right. Yeah, that was great to kind of learn about your involvement and what the design system team is like, and also the process and just your experience so far. So Joe, thank you so much for talking with me today. It's
Thanks, Jay. Those were great questions, and I could talk about this stuff all day with you. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, no problem, Joe. Thank you so much. This is it's been great, man. Hope you have a great rest of the day, and I'll talk to you later.
All right. Thanks a lot. You too.
Take care, Joe. Bye.
You too.